encountered, well, once I did throw the TV channel changer out because it was really making me mad. Well, yeah, that could be. Yeah.
You guys have any? Do you want to share?
Okay, so I'm not an SP, but I know a few. And like one of the examples was and Susan, you've seen the film of this. I have two friends, an ESFP and an ESTP, and they came to my house for a party, and they were both trying to outdo each other on who could be the most outrageous. And it's not a film that we could show anyone because it gets pretty outrageous. But it really had that anything you do, I'm going to up it sort of thing. But also I live with one, and he's sort of anything he knows I like, he'll use to threaten things with. So yeah, so manipulating by blackmail, literally blackmail.
Okay, so one of the things they do is either threaten to do something or to take away something. And they don't always verbalise the threat, sometimes it can just be implied. For example, you know, if the child's starting to climb on something, you say, don't climb on there, and they look at you with a grin on their face and keep climbing a bit higher, because see what they can get away with. So it's not always implied, not always verbalised. So let's have a look at what it says about the artisan. The needs freedom to act on their impulses. And we're talking here about physical freedom, being able to get up and move. It can be something as basic as that. To be impressive or make an impact. They like to do, but they also like to do with skill. You know, they like to have a bit of flair about what they're doing, you know, like be good at what they're doing. And dress for the part too. So, you know, if you go skiing, you don't wear just any old jeans, you've got to wear the right gear and look the part, and the skis have to match your outfit and match your car and all that sort of thing. And fun. Fun is the big thing, and the words you'll hear most often in their language are the words fun or doing. It's all about doing. Now, the game they play is the blackmail game, and they play it when their freedom has somehow been taken away, or they're not allowed to be impressive in some way. And why do they do it? To excite themselves, because they're getting bored or they're not happy, and also to punish you if you've taken away that freedom. Okay, so some examples of the game. I'll give you an example here. Delinquency, I thought, is the first one. It can be anything illegal, anything that breaks the rules. So it could be like dropping some naughty word in front of old Aunt Gertrude and watching her. The other thing, fart jokes. SD kids love fart jokes. And whoopee cushions and things like that. Just anything that breaks sort of social conventions. It could be things like disobeying traffic rules. Like we have lanes in Sydney that you're only allowed to go in if you've got at least two people in the car. Or sometimes they'll cheat, not go in the wrong lane. Or if, you know, it's 5 o'clock in the morning you take your kids to swimming and the lights are red, well, who's going to know? So they just drive through. And when they say this in a workshop, the SJs go, oh, you can't do that, that breaks the rules. But for the SP, that's part of the fun. It's seeing if you can get away with it. They will sometimes break into houses and pinch stuff, not because they want the stuff, but because it's the thrill of seeing if I can get away with it. Or one of the other problems we have in Sydney occasionally is kids surfing on the top of trains. Yeah, and it's got to be an artisan. Nobody else would be doing an artisan. Now, most artisans, if they're doing something risky, will calculate the risk. A healthy artisan will calculate the risk. They won't do something that's life-threatening. They'll sit back and they'll watch first, and then they'll decide. But when they're dysfunctional, they're out to impress their friends or whatever, so they forget to calculate the risk, and that's when they get into trouble. So, yeah, any kind of delinquent activity. One woman told me how she was at a beer festival in Munich and she just whipped off a t-shirt. She had nothing on underneath it. She just wanted to see how people would react. That's the sort of thing they do. And it's purely for the impact.
Would they do that even if not particularly playing a game? I mean, you see what I mean? Is that kind of normal behaviour?
Yeah, well, it can be normal, fun behaviour. But if they get dysfunctional, it becomes more serious behaviour and it can be very dangerous behaviour. Even things like tattooing or putting, you know, big nose rings in your face, or there's people put holes in their ear and that sort of thing. Some of that, they, hypothesise is probably an example of this, where you're trying to break the normal conventions, or kids wear these big mohawk hairdos that are pink, that sort of thing. They're just trying to stand out in some way. Okay, the shocking game, that one's called the shocking game, and you're trying to do that to actually shock people. Binging is a common one. It can be binging on alcohol or binging on food. And again, hiding the fact that you're doing it very often. Now, the interesting thing about this group is they want to be impressive. And they are the most graceful of all the types. They're the types that make really good dancers and musicians and sports people. Most of our professional sportsmen and women come from this group. Because they are really aware of their bodies and can move their bodies well. But of course, if they become dysfunctional, they get into disgraceful behaviour, like vomiting on your girlfriend's shoes, that sort of thing. There's nothing graceful about that, but that's the sort of thing that can happen. What else? Boredom, empty. Being empty is a big problem for them. Even as little children, they'll come home from school and say, school was boring today, we didn't do anything. We just wrote stuff down and read books. We didn't do anything because they want to be up moving. But if it gets to be a more serious problem, that they'll look for something to stimulate them, and that's where they can get into dangerous activity. Often extreme sports, but that can be safe, or they can take too many risks if they get into dysfunctional behaviour. If there is nothing they can do to get rid of the boredom, they'll just sit in front of the television and just let the television stimulate them, and it's just all one way. Just become very passive couch potatoes. What else? It's because they hate not being stimulated. The outrage game. The outrage game is the tantrum throwing. And at a simple level, it can be funny. You see a kid throwing a tantrum in a supermarket, it looks funny. At a simple level, they're performing. It's a performance. And if you joke and play around, they'll stop doing it. But, and I'll tell you, when we get to the intervention strategy, I'll tell you a bit about that. Eva Loomis apparently had some connection with O.J. Simpson and his wife. She said both of them were this type, and both known to be physically violent to each other. And she said if ever you get two artisan improvisers playing the outrage game, if they continue, it will always end in violence. It just escalates and escalates and escalates. You've only got one choice: you either stop the game or you end up in violence. And so if the other person's not willing to stop, you've just got to get out, basically. It's the only thing that will save you. The other two that she also apparently had something to do with, also she said were both artisans, both known to be physically violent to each other, were the Bobbits. Remember the Bobbits?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that was an interesting story. Okay, so that's the... Yes.
Kind of maybe a dumb question, but is there a tie ADHD to this group?
The little bit of research I've seen on ADHD names the SPs and also the NFPs and ENTPs as well, by the way. A lot of kids, I think, who are labelled ADHD are this type, and particularly like ESTPs and ESFPs, because they've got so much physical energy. They're not trying to be naughty, they just can't sit still. And even as 50-year-olds, they're still a bit like that. I don't know if you guys are like that. But they find it, that's why we get so few of them coming to these conferences. The thought of being in a room all day, it's oppressive. They'd rather be outdoors somewhere. And physically they can't sit still for 4 or 5 hours in a classroom. It's painful. And so they're often labelled as ADHD and put on Ritalin. The thing is, if you just leave them alone and get them into sport and music and dance and all that sort of stuff, use up some of their energy, they're no problem. And as they get older, they just get like all other teenagers and slow down, and they're not so active. But that's why they're good at sport and all those things too, because they have that physical energy. Hugh Jackman, for example, a few years ago when he compared the Oscars, he bounced around the stage all night, singing and dancing and carrying on. He was 39 years old, but he was like an ADHD kid because they just have so much energy. So So for many of them, it's not a medical problem. It's just an activity problem. Get them involved in things that use up their energy.
It's also extroverted sensing, being aware of everything. My ESFP daughter, when she was in 6th grade, came home one day and said, "Dad, I'm having a hard time concentrating in class." And she was in a classroom that had centers, so there's 5 different groups doing different things simultaneously. She says, "I hear every chair squeak, I hear every conversation."
Exactly.
And so I'm distracted by all that. And so I was concerned, but she built some filters and was able to get through the year okay. But it's not just the, needing to be moving and doing, but also that aware of everything.
And also, in a school setting, I don't know what the schools are like here in elementary school, but certainly in Australia, there's still a lot of sitting in desks. And if you're sitting in desks reading a book and writing, that's not going to stimulate these kids. And they're bored to tears. My son in year 6, which is the end of elementary school, he came home almost every day. "Mummy, do I have to go to school?" I'm like, "Please, can I stay home?" And I looked around for an alternative school for high school because I thought I can't stand another 6 years of this. He was begging me not to go to school because he had a teacher that was really boring. And I knew the teacher, so I sort of sympathised. Which was a lovely teacher, and she really liked him. But her style was just so different to his. And okay, so let's look at the next group, which is the rational purists. Have you got some stories to tell us?
I call it the Spock defense. If my wife gets really upset with me, I can just kind of look at her and I'm really calm and I don't get emotional. I go, "Well, that's kind of interesting and, that's illogical, and why did you feel that way?" Things like that.
Yes.
I'm better now.
Anyone else have it?
I think we relate it to all 6. I mean, the conversation around the table, all 6 were well represented.
All of them, okay. Can you give us some examples of sorts of things that people do?
I guess we only have one really bad example. We did have actually quite a few examples that were very blatant, blanking out or super intellectual. And I'll give one, but it's really not probably public. But it really is depictive, I think, of saying it straight. After 26 years, I learned my husband was having an affair. And my immediate response was, "Okay, I can move back to the States, I can, start a new job, I can actually move on with life." I instantly intellectualized it and was excited because I could just logic through what was the next step and move on.
And sort of no acknowledgement of the emotions.
No feeling. But we had a number of good examples of, blanking out or really digging into people. What do they think? When you aren't liking what's happening, to really get on them, like asking them questions. What do you think? What do you feel? Try to defer it off of you.
One of the things about the NTs is they have a massive need for competence. And when they're healthy, they are competence seekers. They're constantly looking for how to become more competent and to master the situation. But when they're dysfunctional, what happens is they start to avoid situations where they feel like they might not be competent. And so, of course, you're sabotaging yourself. Because how can you ever be competent if you avoid that situation? And this is the thing about the games. You always sabotage yourself and you think you're getting your needs met, but in fact you prevent yourself from getting your needs met. It's like the Guardian who sort of tries to pull people in to come around them and look after them by being sick, and then people get sick of it and they start pushing them away. And the artisan who does all those delinquent behaviours, trying to exercise their freedom so they can feel free, but what happens is they end up being put in jail or at school, they're put on detention or something, and their freedom is restricted. Okay? And the same with the NTs. If they're avoiding situations where they might not be the best at it, then they don't learn to be competent. So here we are. We've got the rationals. What they want is mastery, self-control, knowledge, competence, achievement, all of those things. And the game they play is the robot game. Basically, shut down emotionally and dismiss your emotions as irrelevant. And why they're doing it? For two reasons. To distract themselves from feeling incompetent, but also to distract you so that you won't notice that they're incompetent. So, what's some examples here? That's illogical. So in an argument, they can beat you down with comments like, that's illogical, where's your empirical evidence? Show me the proof. And of course, as if you don't have the proof in your pocket, you know. Or super intellectual, you know, I've got 2 degrees in that, so I know better than you do. That kind of thing.
Sorry, don't STJ do that often?
No.
You know, like, show me the study. Like,
Oh yeah, they're looking for evidence.
Yeah. A lot of the scientism, you know,
Yeah.
comes from that.
But looking for evidence is a different thing, but trying to beat somebody down because they can't produce the evidence is a different thing altogether. It can become a game, you know, where you're just trying to beat the person into submission because you can't win the argument any other way.
That's my experience of most of STJ.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It could happen. And by the way, these games are not exclusively in edge temperament, but what I have found is if people start to play a game that doesn't look like it belongs to that temperament, they vary it in some way so that it is meeting their needs, or they don't continue to play it. Nitpicking, now the thing about the artisan, the rational theorists, is that they are wordsmiths. They do like to get the word precise, right? But nitpicking is more than that. It's when you start picking up on insignificant things that are kind of a distraction, like you put the full stop in the wrong place or something like that, something really insignificant that really you could just let go. Superstitious behaviour. Had a woman tell me once that she had a lucky pencil case. You know, in school she had this pencil, she used to take all her pencils to school in this pencil case, and right through high school she knew that if she had that pencil case with her when she did an exam, she would be successful, she'd pass the exam. She got to 3rd year at university, she was going for an exam, and she couldn't find the pencil case. She turned the house upside down looking for this pencil case. She turned up an hour late for the exam rather than go without the pencil case. So yeah, that's the sort of thing we're talking about. Really, it's really crazy kind of behaviour, and people around you would say, you know, what on earth are you doing? But to them, it's important. The nitpicking one, another example of that, it's sort of along this line. They can get very fussy about germs, sort of obsessively fussy about germs. I knew someone who, she was working in a business where she, towards the end of the financial year, which for us is June, she had to get a lot of the accounts ready for the accountant to balance all the books and everything. And it was a very difficult time for her because she was an INTJ and very capable, but all that detailed work drove her crazy. And what she found was during the month of June, she would become really obsessed about germs. And she said to me, Mary, she said, I go home at night, we have dinner, we put all the dishes in the dishwasher and wash them, take them out, put them in the cupboard. When I get up in the morning, I cannot eat off them unless I wash them again. And she said, I know up here it doesn't make any sense, but I can't help myself. But as soon as all that accounting period is over, she relaxes and it doesn't happen anymore. Okay. The other thing that happens around the same time of the year, and she was when she was telling me this, it was about 20 or 30 years after this incident. And the incident was she was in a house babysitting some kids, and the two little toddlers went out the back, and somebody had left the ladder in the pool. And luckily the older one came in and said, Bubby, Bubby, and so they ran out. Here was the 18 months old baby floating in the pool and starting to turn blue. And this person telling me the story, she was 16 years old when this happened, and she's screaming to the neighbours for help. And as she's trying to get this child to breathe. And now, like 30 years later, she said, every time I get severely stressed, this image of this event keeps flashing back into my head. And sort of the theory says that you're doing this, you're filling your head up with these images so that you don't have to think about the fact that you're feeling a bit incompetent at work or in whatever you're doing. Okay? What's another one? Oh, the blanking out. Well, yeah, this is where they forget things that they know really well, but they only do it in certain situations where they feel a bit intimidated or don't feel confident. One woman told me she was on a board in this organisation, and she said she was okay, she was very confident, very highly regarded, but when there was a certain partner in the group, and when he was there, when he came to the meetings, she would forget the most simple, everyday, ordinary things like numbers. And she'd be counting out 1, 2, 3, and for the life of her, she couldn't remember what was the next number after 3. And she said it only happened when that one person was there. And again, the theory says you're filling up your head with something to distract you so that you don't have to think about the fact that you feel incompetent. Another one was a woman, an INTP. She said her son had a girlfriend for about 3 years. The son was in his 20s, and she said, I never liked this woman, never liked her, couldn't stand her. But we often ended up at social functions together. And she said, I turned around to introduce her. Do you think I could remember her name? And that went on for 3 years, and she was so relieved when they broke up. But she said, I didn't want her to be there. And so her mind would just shut her out.
And that was one that happened when I don't like someone. I would, have a difficult time remembering names in general, but if it's someone I know, like if it's not that I don't like them, I completely forget their name.
Yeah, shut them out.
I know, it's my way of shutting them out, and I see them, and impossible. I don't know. I actually remember, I actually blank out on situations, perhaps how we met, or how we something, just because it's a stressor, it's a person I don't really want. It's just something.
Another example, another variation on the game is the haunted game, and this one is where something gets into your head and it won't go away, and it stays there for days. Like it could be an advertising jingle that goes round and round your head, about Kentucky Fried Chicken or something like that. I've got a brother, for him, it's one of Beethoven's symphonies. It will just stay there for days until that sort of fear or whatever it is goes away. I've had, again, it can be a flashing image that comes into your mind, as I mentioned with the other lady. I don't know, somebody else had an example there, but I can't remember what it was. But anything like that, anything that stays in your head and just won't go away. And as soon as the problem goes, or the problem's fixed, people find that it just disappears, the haunted problem goes away. And again, they can be playing several of these. We had a woman on the MBTI qualifying program in Sydney years ago, and we had a group of about 20 people, and she kept saying she was an INFP, but she kept annoying everybody. And I thought, this doesn't sound like an INFP. And what she was doing, when we sat back and looked at the game she was playing, it was the super intellectual and that's illogical. So we'd be having discussions about type and all this stuff, and she'd be jumping on people saying, no, you're not right about that, or no, this is not right. And then she started saying, well, I've done a degree in that, and I've got a degree in linguistics, and she would sort of right over the top of people to the point where it was getting really annoying. And on the last day we had this exercise where they got into triads and they had to role play, giving feedback about typing. And she was sitting in the group with this lovely ISFJ woman, and within about 10 minutes she had her in tears. And I don't know exactly what happened, but I spent the rest of the day trying to deal with both of them. And I was so relieved when the course finished. And she kept saying, oh, it's not my problem, it's her problem, it's not my problem. And you could see that she was emotional, but she wouldn't admit that she was emotional at all. It's all that other woman's problem. And anyway, after she went, I sat down with the trainer I was working with, and we went through and we looked at all the games, and we said, yeah, look, she's definitely playing this. She's not an INFP, she's an INTP probably. And 2 days later, I get this fax. It says, Mary, guess what? I'm really an INTP. And she said, the reason I was I was so badly behaved at the course was everybody else in the room knew what type they were, and I couldn't figure out mine. So it was a confidence issue. Amazing. And of course, in the moment, she didn't think she was at fault doing anything. That's the thing. You can look back at it later on and say, yeah, I was a bit over the top there, but at the time you don't feel like you're a bit over the top. Okay, is that all? Yes.
Mary, did I hear you mention hoarding?
Sorry?
Hoarding? Hoarding?
Haunted.
Oh, haunting.
Hoarding. I haven't thought about hoarding. That's one we should look at, actually. I haven't thought about
Well, I don't know in Australia, but there's this big stuff on television.
Yes,
You
I know,
know,
I've seen
shows
some.
about hoarding, and it's just, I've only looked at a couple because it's so horrifying.
Yes.
But I just wondered, is there any correlation between type and who chooses hoarding to avoid stuff?
That'd be really interesting to look at. I'm tempted to think, I don't know.
There was another session that we were in, that, you know, has occurred with the organizing.
Oh, the Pixies.
Yeah. And even though they don't do that work, they say what you'll notice is that there's probably a type relationship to how the hoard and what the hoard is.
Yeah.
So there is actually diversity in hoard. Now, you know, for those of us that see it, we just like, it's a bunch of junk all over the place. But they say it's probably, you know, in that, but there are specialists, you know, that really only deal with the hoard.
Yeah, that would be an interesting one to look into. It'd be interesting to talk about.
You may
It's interesting that you just asked that, because out of all the 4 that we're going through, this one has 3 specifics that are focused on obsession, right? And so hoarding is a type of obsessive.
Yes, and I have heard,
As are 3 of these.
I've seen other material where they've referred to NTs as having a tendency to obsessive compulsive. Okay, we're going to keep moving. Where are the catalysts? Catalyst idealists. Can we hear quickly some stories from any of the groups? We need to be quick. We've got 3 groups here, so have you got any stories, anyone? Come on, you can say somebody else's story.
Okay, we talked about this time, and I think what struck for me was the martyr, you know, being, sacrificing identity to keep peace in a relationship. And I never thought about it as I was being a martyr. I just thought that was what had to be done. My definition of a martyr was a type who kind of brought it up to everybody all the time, which I never did. But in retrospect, I spent a lot of my life in relationships doing that, just feeling like I needed to keep the peace, and not thinking about that, you know, what I wanted in something.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it showed up a lot for me.
Yes, it's when you're doing things and you're not being honest about what you need. You're doing it to keep the peace, avoiding conflict because you don't like the anger. Okay, anyone else that comment?
Well, if I had been sitting at a table of catalysts and idealists, what I might have heard is everyone say they had done some version of mind reading and martyr. If I had been sitting there.
Oh, yeah. Martyrdom's a very common one with all of the MFs.
And we tend to just think it, we think it just needs to be done, it's important. So, I don't know that it's a conscious game, I think it's an unconscious game, but the thing inside seems to be, this is important and it needs to be done.
And the most common version of it is that you give up your own identity to please the other person.
Yeah. Been there, done that.
Yeah, I think one of the things I struggle with the martyr terminology is, you know, growing up, martyrs were always the ones who I think were very verbal about it. Oh, woe is me, I did this. And I think our version of martyrdom is we don't necessarily go and tell everybody we do it, we just do it.
Yeah. Oh, actually, it's interesting. The thing about martyrs, where they're different from the guardians over here who complain, they'll complain out loud. The martyrs don't actually complain. They do it willingly, but they let you know. They let you know, and therefore there's this message that you owe me something. Look at what I'm doing for you. But they would never say that. Never say that.
Martyrdom is not said. It's normal. I'm an NT at an NT table, but I know I'm proud of NFs in my life, and a lot of what is done for me by an NF I know I owe a debt, and oftentimes it's not really said. It's interesting how they can sort of put that on you, make you let it know, let it be known and felt by another person without explicitly complaining ever about it or saying it, but I know I have a debt to pay. So I've been receiving it and then monitoring.
Okay, so some examples, by the way,
Yes.
anyone else, is there anyone else down there?
I had something to add to that with the martyr situation. I am definitely have done that in the past, but what I've noticed if I'm in extreme stress case with other people, and it's usually to avoid conflict, because that's one of our feared conflict, is to pretend that everything's okay, but it goes beyond the martyrdom. It's almost like there's almost an additional sweetness that, because that's not normal for us to be upset with somebody. So, I can see that sometimes they put on a superficial face of, oh, you're so great and everything's so wonderful and you're so kind, when really it's not, because there's stress in the relationship.
See, this is the type that want to be authentic. That's the driver in their life, want to be true to themselves. But what happens when they're playing games is they pretend. So, yeah, I'm okay, everything's fine. I can remember when my daughter was first born, it was quite a shock to have a child with a disability, and I had her, put her into a program at Macquarie University in Sydney. There was an early intervention program for 6 years before she started school. It was quite a bit of time commitment. But every day I would drive over there and I would be in tears. This went on for months, in tears, until I got near the entrance where the man in the grey coat was standing at the thing to check the cars as they came in. I'd wipe away the tears and I'd look up and go, "Hi, how are you this morning?" And I'd go in there and I'd be in there with all these mothers, and they all seemed to be coping so well. And so I would get on and I'd cope and I'd do everything I had to do. It took us 3 years before the mothers all sat down and all confessed to each other that they were all basket cases and not coping, but they all looked around at everybody else, and everybody else seemed to be coping, so therefore they all played the game of pretending. That's what you do. Okay, and why are you doing it? To deceive yourself and to deceive others. The person they lie to most of all is themselves. And they would never ever want to be deliberately dishonest or unauthentic. But that's in fact what happens when they start to play the game. So the mind reader is a simple one. It's just that where you assume that you know what that other person really means. She said hello to me, but I know what she's really thinking. The martyrdom one we've talked about a bit. The grasshopper is a very common one, especially with ENFPs, I've discovered. ENFPs are masters at it. If you're having a discussion with somebody and you get close to something that they really don't want you to know about, all of a sudden you find you're talking about Phoenix, Arizona, or Hawaii, or something else, and you think, how do we get there? And it's all, they don't even have to think about doing it. They just have this art of moving the conversation automatically to avoid the things they don't like talking about. A variation on that I realised years ago, and I didn't hear this from Eve the Lunas, but a variation on it, I think when this type, and particularly the NFPs, when they don't want to deal with something or they're not ready to deal with it, they make themselves very, very busy. If you're very busy, you don't have time to stop and think about it. And so busyness can sometimes be a way of playing grasshopper, not dealing with the issue because you don't stop long enough to look at it.
This is something I struggle with, the authenticity of, because you mentioned the introverted feeling, and then they don't want to be inauthentic, but at the same time playing masculine. How does that seem to...
A healthy idealist would never be inauthentic. They will try to be as honest and as open and as true to themselves as they can be. And in fact, they spend their whole lives going to courses like Myers-Briggs or psychological type, Enneagram, dream workshops, you name it. They'll go to everything, even on their weekends, and they'll pay for it themselves because they want to be true to themselves and want to be authentic. But if they become dysfunctional, this is what happens. They start to play pretend games. And they can get quite serious pretend games as well. Did anybody come up with the statue one? That's where the body starts to shut down and doesn't perform properly. I had a friend, INFJ, and at the age of about 33 it was, and it often happens at midlife, he became partially paralysed down the right side of the body. This guy was 2 degrees and he couldn't pick up his pen and sign his own name. And went to doctor after doctor after doctor, and nobody could find out what was wrong with him. There wasn't anything physical. He eventually went to this fellow, quite well known in Australia, who did a lot of meditation work with him, and at the same time came across type and discovered he was an INFJ who had never given life to that introverted intuition, which is the dominant gift. And the dominant gift is really important. He'd grown up with an ISTJ father and an ISTJ older brother, an ESFJ mother and sister. So it was a very SJ family. And he said he could remember sitting out in the backyard when he was 9 years old talking to his imaginary friends, and his father coming out and saying, "No, get back in the real world." So he tried to do that. He tried to live an ISTJ life. He became a school teacher, became a school principal, became a director of a college of advanced education, and then this paralysis came. And when he realised what it was about, the fact that he hadn't given life to that creative side, and Jung would say, if you haven't, if you don't pay attention to your dominant, eventually it's going to catch up, and you won't be able to function properly. So you have to go back and deal with your dominant function. And so he did that. He threw in his job. He went and worked in Sydney in this place with derelicts and drug addicts, and then he left there and went to the Kimberleys way out in the desert, met up with tribal Aborigines and got in touch with their spirituality, and then all this poetry started to pour out there. And he's actually published 7 books of poetry, which is in Australia is pretty rare. Most people are not that interested in poetry. But it's not physical enough. But over the next 3 years, the paralysis started to go. And by the way, you'll find with INFJs, if there are any here, the other thing, apart from that paralysis, that's not an uncommon one. If they get to this stage where they're not paying attention to what they need to pay attention to. Another one is chronic fatigue and glandular fever. The same guy 20 years later, who was overdoing it, leading a very extroverted life, went to the doctor and said, "I'm really lethargic." And the guy said, "Go to bed for 2 years." He said, "You've got chronic fatigue." And it took 5 years before he fully recovered. Just couldn't work.
What was the other one?
Glandular fever and Crohn's disease are also heard too. INFJs tend to get problems that pervade the whole body. So the whole body starts to shut down basically, and they're in hospital or there for the next few years. Okay, forgetful. Forgetful is when there's something you don't want to deal with, so you just forget to deal with it. An example, a woman had a client in Singapore, and she said, "I had to ring this person. We agreed to have this meeting on the phone at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon to sort of decide whether we were going to go ahead with this project." And she said, "I put notes everywhere, I wrote in my diary." 4 o'clock in the afternoon came and she totally forgot all about it. And she said, "I really didn't want to work with that guy. I don't like him." And this is what NFs will do. They'll just avoid confronting the situation and standing up to the person saying, "No, I don't want to do it," because they don't want to be nasty or they don't want the confrontation, and it'll manifest in some way in the body. The other one is the twitching. Like it could be a twitching mouth or an eye that flickers or something. That's much more common with NFs as well. Okay. Right. Well, let's move on. We're going to watch the time here. So we've looked around this little bit of a look at the sort of games people play. Now we're going to look at what can you do to deal with the game, to intervene so that not only do you stop the gameplay, but you maintain the relationship. It's really important that you maintain the relationship. You don't want to damage the relationship. And so, remember we said with each of these that it was about core needs. If our needs are not met or we don't feel safe, this is why we play the games. So the answer to the intervention strategies is there. The first thing you need to do is look at those core needs and make sure those needs are met. What often happens when people are dysfunctional, we try to change their behaviour. And that might work for a while. In the short term, you might get a bit of a shift, but it won't last. If the problem is coming from these needs not being met, then that's what you have to deal with if you want any permanent change. And if you do that, it does work. So for example, and there's a sheet here, somebody mind giving those out? Okay, so we'll go through these fairly quickly. And we'll give, if you've got some examples you want to share, or maybe you won't have time to share them. Okay. So the first thing is help them to belong. Make sure they have, for the guardians, make sure that that need for belonging is met in some way. Make sure there's order and structure, particularly with children. Give them responsibility, but also, with a lot of guardians, it's not only about giving them responsibility, but sometimes redefining what we mean by responsibility. Because some guardians, and I suspect this is more the SFJs, they'll often do everything for their kids. You know, the mother will be at home vacuuming the floor, cooking the meals, doing the washing, and the husband and the kids could be sitting back there watching television and not helping at all. And she's complaining about it and complaining about it. It would help to redefine responsibility and to say responsibility doesn't mean you have to do everything for your children. There are certain things that need to be done for them, but you don't have to do them all. Part of your responsibility is teaching your children to be responsible. Okay, rather than doing everything for them.
On the same lines as that, or I was earlier, what about just having the ability to take responsibility? So not, when you say give them responsibility or have a responsibility, we think about, like you mentioned, the back and the floor, here's my chore for them. But they complain and they blame.
Yep.
And so to get these guardians to actually be able to take responsibility, is that along the same line?
Well, what you've got to do is find something that they can be responsible for. And treat them like a responsible person. Give them something they can. It might be something really simple. It doesn't have to be anything spectacular. It could be looking after the dog or feeding the dog, or it could be putting them in charge of the filing cabinet or something like that. Whatever they can manage, basically, depending on their ability at the time. But if you keep treating them like an invalid, they'll keep behaving like an invalid. And so redefine responsibility. Teach them to relax and set limits. I had a woman come to our qualifying program years ago. She was a doctor, a general practitioner, and she said, I don't want to use the questionnaire and I don't want to run workshops. I just want to understand my patients because I get a lot of patients coming in and begging me for pills. And she said, I don't want to give them pills. I do all these tests and I can't find anything wrong with them, but they keep wanting me to give them medication. Now, she had worked out the perfect solution. It was just perfect. We fitted this beautifully. So she said, what I've learned to do is I take out my prescription pad and I write down, every day around 4 o'clock, you must lie down for 1 hour with your feet up and listen to classical music. And when the hour is up, I want you to sit up and write in a book how you feel. And when you come back in 2 weeks' time, bring me the book so I can see what you've written. Now, what she was doing was prescribing rest and relaxation. And she said, by the way, put it on the fridge, on the refrigerator, so everybody in the family could see it. So they knew why she was doing it. Now, a guardian will do that because the doctor said so and the doctor's an authority figure. And they'll do that rather than go to a counsellor. But what it does was prescribe relaxation, which they wouldn't normally do for themselves. If a guardian sits down and listens to classical music, they'll often think that they're wasting time. I should be peeling the potatoes or cleaning out the cupboards or something. And so it was a prescription. So it was a perfect example.
With the handouts, the office is all closed. It's too late. So if you want a copy, they said, would you be right?
In the morning,
to eat.
Or if anyone missed out, come and see me and I'll get your email address and all that. Okay, help them live more in the now. Guardians live in the past most of the time. I remember in 1976 you did that. So, why are we talking about 1976? Bring them into the present. How often has he done it recently? How many times? Oh, my husband always does that. Well, how often? When was the last time? Oh, it was about 4 years ago. So, pin them down to focusing on the now. teach them not to nag and blame. Teach them other alternatives. Like, for example, go to the person and say, look, this is what I need, or this is what's upsetting me. So, okay, the next one, artisans. Remember, their need is for freedom, action, fun. Give them freedom. Now, if an artisan's misbehaving, the last thing most people will think of is give them freedom, but it works. But you give them freedom within boundaries. Okay, you've got to have the boundaries. If you've ever come across Glass's model about choices, or choice therapy, it's a really good model for it. It works really well with these kids. Real choices with real consequences. So if the person's doing something you don't like, it doesn't matter whether it's a kid or a person at work, if you say, you can say to them, look, if you continue to do this, this is what's going to happen. What I want you to do, this is the alternative, you could do this and this is what will happen. Now if you give them very clear choices and very clear consequences and they know that you mean it, they will choose a consequence that they like. Because one of the things about artisans is they're always concerned about what's in it for me. It's a big issue with artisans, especially the STPs. Okay? So give them real choices, real consequences. I'll give you an example. I have this delightful ESFP son, and to give you an example of what he's like when he was functioning well as a child, one day I've been vacuuming the floor, I turned off the vacuum cleaner and he's sitting over there and he gets up with his hands on his hips and he says, now Mum, how would you like it if I stopped spending so much time watching television? Now, what mother wouldn't respond to that? I said, I really like that, Damien. He said, well, he puts his hand right like this. What's it worth to you? I said, well, what's it going to cost me? And he said, look at the new Lego catalogue. Perfect salesman, yeah. But there was another time, he was about 6 years old, it was a few months after I'd done the workshop with McGuiness, and I had a policy with him, knowing that he was P like myself and how easy it is to start things and not finish them. When he decided he wanted to do piano lessons, I said, okay, if you sign up for the year. Well, this was only about March, He hadn't been in it long, but it was boring stuff, And we went out to the car to go to his lesson this afternoon, and he sat in the car and he said, oh, Mum, I've been talking to Daddy, I'm not going to do piano anymore. I turned around and said, don't talk to your father. You signed up for the year and you're going to finish the year. And he says, oh, but it's on when the Power Rangers is on and I want to watch the Power Rangers. And so he's throwing this tantrum in the car, and I'm sitting there thinking, what am I going to do? If I drag him into the music lesson and force him to do it, it sort of defeats the purpose a little bit, so I can't do that. So I thought, well, Mary, you paid all this money to go to that conference and meeting to learn us and do this workshop, so put it into practice. So I sat there and very quickly thought, what am I going to do? And I just, by the way, give them choices, but show no emotional investment in what they choose. So I sat there very calmly and I said, Damien, if you don't go to music lessons, I'll sell the television. He sat there, no emotion, no movement, stared through the windscreen, took him half a minute and said, okay, I'll go. This big performance, and it was just a performance. Okay? And of course, the deal with him was I said, look, I'll video the Power Rangers so you can still see it. It never happened again, not once ever. And one night we're at church and it was a long ceremony and we came out of the church and his father said to me, oh, Damien, I'm so proud you were so well behaved tonight, like he wasn't his usual fidgety self. And he looked up at his father and he said, Daddy, do you know why I behaved myself tonight? He said, no. He said, because Mummy was here. Because he knew when I said something, I meant it. He said, they've got to have boundaries, absolutely must have boundaries. They don't like them and they'll push against them, but they must have them. No lectures. God, they would rather you cut their arm off than give them a lecture. And it's the same at work, long staff meetings and long explanations, they hate it. Just get to the point quickly. And do a deal with them. Challenge them, make it a fun or a contest, help them find out what's in it for them and be consistent. These are the most streetwise of all of the types. From a very early age, they know exactly how to get what they want. And they know what money will do for them too. So what you have to do is make sure that they get it in a socially acceptable kind of way. So the kid who throws himself on the floor in the supermarket because mummy won't buy him that toy and he screams and hollers, he's doing it as a performance. He wants mummy to give in, and he thinks if I embarrass her enough, she'll give in. And if she's a feeler, she probably will if she's silly. But if you give in, you are lost forever. Forever.